My name is James Richard Kelly, named after my father, and I was born in Roswell, New Mexico in 1943 on October 14th. Yeah, no, I actually think this is a pretty good story. I was in Berkeley, and my brother was teaching at St. Elizabeth's in the Fruitvale district of inner city Oakland, and they needed a physics teacher. And so he called me up and said, they need a physics teacher. Do you want to teach physics in high school, which I'd never done. And I had not yet graduated from UC Berkeley. But that didn't matter. I was almost graduated, so I started teaching physics to an advanced physics group. And as I was teaching, one of the women who was teaching special ed got pregnant and had to leave, and they asked me if I wanted to teach human physiology to special ed students. And I said I'd never taken a biology course and I knew nothing about it. And they said, that's all right, these are special ed kids, you just stay one page ahead of them. So I could use the money, so I said, sure. And as I taught the human physiology class, the SPED group, I realized they were not anything special about them except they were a little bit hard to control. They were certainly no less bright than my advanced physics group, and I wondered, why are they in there? And they said they enjoyed the group they were with. Nothing was expected of them. It was an easy ride, and that's why they were there. And it made me realize that there's a lot wrong with education. And one of the worst things was the tracking system, where people were put somewhere assuming they were of a certain intellect, which I have found since is not ever the case. So that started me off with a group of the other teachers at St. Elizabeth's, including my brother, to reform the system and get rid of the tracking system. They hired some very good teachers at that school. We loved the school. The students were exceptional. It was a very diverse group, half Hispanic or black, half white, inner city, Oakland, Fruitvale district, tough district, working district, bright kids. They hired a guy, Ed Borges from Berkeley, who was a radical. We all were basically radical-ish. And they fired him using the reason that he was wearing a blue jean jacket to a sports event on Saturday. And one of our members who started the school, Paul August, was on the administrative board because there was one faculty member that could be on the board, and Paul came out of the board meeting where they fired Ed and said, we just fired Ed Borges. We all went to work to save Ed's job, along with students and parents, which was very nice. We had a lot of support, but we got fired anyway. And after we got fired, we realized we enjoyed those students so much, and we enjoyed teaching so much, and we enjoyed each other's camaraderie so much that we should start a school. So we started Maybeck High School. Stanley came up with that name. Everybody had ideas for names, but we all went with Stanley's name after Maybeck, the local architect who did some amazingly nice work. And that's kind of what we wanted to be, an architect that did good work. After we decided to name it Maybeck, Stanley and a few of the students called up Mrs. Maybeck, who was still alive, and asked if they could have tea together. And she gave us the blessing to use the name, and she was delighted. And Stan brought 2 students and himself, and they had tea. Stanley, I'll have to say it again, was the heart of the school. He just always made the right judgment. And that's hard to do, you know. And the other thing that Maybeck had going for it is we had no administration. We were the administration. And so we used to complain at the Catholic school that the administrators were doing this right or this wrong. But once you do it yourself, you got to put up with what you've done. We started the school with 3 rules. One was no violence of any kind, physical or mental, no drugs or alcohol, and you had to want to be there. You had to do the work. Those are the only 3 rules. As long as you followed those rules, you'd remain a student. And when we interviewed students to come to the school, we'd ask them, do you want to go to Maybeck? And a lot of them would say, no, I don't. I want to go to Berkeley High. I want to go to a real school with a lot of social activity. And so we say, well, rest assured, you will not be accepted. But if anybody else said they really wanted to go and really wanted to work, they were accepted. So there were no entrance exams. So that was the start of the school. So it was a very unusual school. Probably just to tell you a story about the flavor of the school, we'd start the school every year at Feather River. It was kind of like a boot camp. So we'd go up there. We didn't have any cooks or anything. We did our own cooking. We did our own cleaning. And that means the students and the teachers, everybody pitched in and did everything. We had no money, which was an advantage because we couldn't afford any cooks or anything like that. And at Feather River, we would have lectures on a certain topic, and all the different teachers would speak to those topics, and all the teachers would be there, and that was enormously helpful because there were some good teachers, and the problem with schools is you never hear your fellow teacher, and you never hear their class, and at Maybeck you heard what they had to say, and you could disagree with them, which we often did, and it was a kind of a free-for-all, and that was good, I think, for everybody. And the school was so small, it was easy to do. The other good thing about the school, very good thing, was we went on trips. So in January, we'd have special programs where we'd go out and each teacher would take a group of students and go somewhere in California and do something. And one year, Stanley decided to take the whole school on one of those trips, and he called it the California trip. So we bought a bus, school surplus, yellow bus, put the whole school in the bus, and we started out. And none of us knew where we were going except for Stanley. So we drove down to Monterey for the first night, camped out, got up in the morning, went to Cannery Row. Stanley stood out on the sardine factories on the steps there and read Cannery Row, Steinbeck, as the sun was coming up, and it kind of gave you a feel that you're going to be looking at California. The second place we went was Fort Ord. Pulled up to the gate, and the war was going on, and Stanley asked if we could come in. And they said, "Ed, you made reservations?" And Stan said, "No, but I have a bunch of young students who may be drafted, and they'd like to see what it's all about." So the guy at the gate calls up, and pretty soon somebody comes out and says, "Yes, come in." And they took us in and gave us a complete tour of Fort Ord, which was amazing. They gave us field kitchen lunch, and it was a very, and the students were able to talk to new recruits and ask them how they liked the Army, and anything they wanted to ask. It was wide open. It was surprising. And Stan himself didn't know they'd let him in, and we all looked a little scraggly. We were all hippies. So that was interesting. And then we drove on down. The second stop was Gallo Winery, because there was a big boycott by the farm workers against Gallo. And we talked to the farm workers about their struggles with Gallo, and then we talked to Gallo. So it was that kind of trip where we went around California. We looked at hot spots. We made it up to Tahoe to see if the lake was clearer or filthier because of the new casinos they were putting up there. And of course, the casinos were going to destroy the environment. We talked to this guy by the name of Smiley, I think it was, at the Chamber of Commerce, and he said the lake is 10 times cleaner than it was before the casinos. He had all the stats and facts, and the students could ask him any kind of question they liked. And our last stop was in Sacramento, where we went to Jerry Brown's office, and Jerry was known not to meet with anybody at that time. Governor Moonbeam, but Stanley had roomed with him at High House at Berkeley. Not room, but they were in the High House at the same time. And so he had called Jerry, it's the only preparation he made, and asked if Jerry would see us. And Jerry said, "Well, pretty busy as governor, but I'll have my right-hand person there." So we stopped to ask the problems of California. And during the discussion, Jerry came in and talked with the students. And it was just an amazing trip. It's the kind of trip you just don't get. And that was all Stanley's doing. And none of the rest of us knew what was happening, but it was educational for all of us. And one of my trips was the observatories in California. And we went to Mount Lick and several observatories. It was a great trip. We ended up at Hat Creek, where the radio astronomy lab is for the UC Berkeley. We saw 3 telescopes that were being used and 1 telescope that was not being used. And we wondered if we could maybe use that telescope ourselves. And Charlie Souza, who was a student and by now a teacher, said, "Well, let's just call them up and ask them." And so we called Jack Welsh, who was the director of the radio astronomy, and asked Jack, "Is it all right if we use that old telescope since it's not being used?" And Jack says, "Well, the motors are rusty. There's no electronics on it. It was a microwave telescope, so you'd have to do microwave electronics rather than just regular lower frequency electronics, and that's trickier." But it was a famous telescope. It was the first telescope to discover interstellar water, any kind of molecule in space. And so we decided we were going to take that on and make it whole again. So I got some students, and we actually got that done. We got it up and running in microwave by getting contributions from the Silicon Valley people. We put out a newsletter and sent it back to the Silicon Valley people, thanking them for it and showing them our progress. And we learned a lot about electronics. We learned a lot about mechanics. We learned a lot about everything. That was one of, I think, our best classes. It was my best class. Stan and I, every year, we taught thinkers. That's what we called it. Would take a topic, and the topic would be anything. It could be anything, but it would be something Stan and I disagree about severely. And what would happen is I would hand out my reading, and the students would read it, and the next day they would come in and they would discuss it, and Stan and I could not talk about it at all. Both of us had to be quiet. We just sat there and listened to the student discussion of my paper on that topic. And when it started off, for the first half hour, nobody said anything, because students weren't used to running the class. But as the time went on, they got good at it. So they discussed the topic, and from the point of view that I gave it to them from. And then Stan would hand out his reading, which was diametrically opposed to what I'd just given them. And the next day, they would come in and discuss Stan's reading, and he and I could not talk. Well, that was already tough, because it was so opposite what they were talking about the previous day that it was hard. You had to almost take a side. And if you took a side, you'd be offending one of the teachers. And then the last day, there was a free-for-all where everybody could talk. That was a great class, because that forced the students to teach and to think. I think not enough is expected of students. You know, they're expected to learn certain things, and it's limitless what they do learn, if you let them, you know. But all the students, I mean, the reason we stayed with it at $90 a month is the students, obviously, were intriguing. And they were all individual. And the other thing is, there was no put down of ideas, or ideas were wide open.